Hey guys, imagine waking up in the year 117 AD, no Wi-Fi, no Starbucks, just the stench of plaster, sewage, and a heat so oppressive it could melt your face off. Sound fun? Yeah, thought not. Before you start planning your Roman vacation, hit that like button if you think you'd survive this chaos. Or tell me in the comments your biggest worry: vomiting in the forum, getting sold as a gladiator. Either way, buckle up, because today I'm gonna show you why your Instagram filters wouldn't save you a single day in the Roman Empire's brutal, bug-infested, golden age nightmare. So dim the lights, get a little nervous, and let's dive into a civilization that would have eaten you alive, literally. A modern traveler, in a moment of quiet curiosity, steps through the heavy marble arches of ancient Rome, eyes drawn upward to the towering columns that seem to hold up the sky. The streets buzz softly with merchants, passers-by, and distant chariots, merging into a slow tapestry of human effort and noise. There is a faint breeze that carries the scent of olives and baked bread, and for a fleeting instant, the place feels almost timeless, familiar in its bustle. The traveler's face holds a curious smile, overwhelmed perhaps by the grandiosity and the crowded, noisy calm of the city's entrance. It's a scene of quiet wonder, an ordinary moment of human achievement, still alive after centuries, yet somehow fragile enough to unravel upon closer inspection. As the traveler moves deeper into the city, the mood shifts subtly. The stone flags beneath their feet become uneven, and a stern centurion appears nearby, waving a hand to halt the flow of approaching pedestrians. A sharp voice, edged with authority, prompts an inspection. Documents must be shown, belongings examined, a basket of bread, a simple cloak quickly scrutinized. The natural friendliness of the crowd thins under the weight of suspicion. The traveler's wide eyes are met with watchful gazes, and a faint sense of unease begins to nibble at the edges of that initial wonder. The city, it seems, is not just a place of marvel, but one of strict order and constant caution, where curiosity might quickly turn to suspicion. Ironically, as the traveler navigates the bustling streets, they observe the soldiers, a legion of men in armor, casually leaning against columns or idly chatting, whose suspicion is plain, yet somehow mundane. Their faces, partially obscured by helmets, appear blurred in the dappled sunlight, as if they are less individuals and more fixtures of the city's machinery. A soldier's gaze lingers a moment too long on a merchant's cart, turning innocent bartering into a quiet test of patience. The bustling noise has softened into a hum of quiet questions and muffled commands, revealing the strangely routine nature of power and watchfulness in this place. It's all normal, perhaps a little absurd, yet beneath it, A subtle tension persists, muffling the hum of daily life. Eventually, the traveler finds a moment of stillness, sitting on a step as the city's din ebbs into background murmur. The sun dips lower, casting long shadows across the stone facades, bathing the grand columns in a warm, golden hue. The reality of their situation, the strict curfew, the meticulous inspections, settles softly over them like a blanket. Necessary, perhaps, but confining. The faces of the soldiers, once suspicion's sharp edge, now seem softer in the gentle light, their routines silently ongoing. In this quiet, distant corner, the traveler observes the simple act of waiting, the everyday dance of human resilience underneath the grandeur. It's a moment of calm in the midst of the chaos, an unspoken acknowledgement of human imperfection woven into the fabric of this ancient city. As they prepare to leave, the traveler reflects on the city's quiet irony. Behind its splendor and intimidating discipline lies a persistent, gentle human rhythm, ordinary lives pressed softly into the monumental. The forgotten faces, blurred in shadows or hidden by light, embody centuries of patience, curiosity, and resilience. The city hums on, timeless yet fleeting, a place where wonder is often tempered by necessity and humor. They realize that the grandeur of Rome isn't just in its stones or statues, but in the delicate, often unnoticed, persistence of its everyday human stories that, like the traveler's own, drift quietly into the quiet night. In the heart of ancient Rome, the traveler stepped into the city with a quiet sense of curiosity, noting the paved stones beneath their feet and the distant hum of voices echoing through shaded colonnades. Everything seemed deliberate, clothing, gestures, the subtle weight of history pressing softly upon the shoulders of passers-by. Yet, as they moved deeper into the bustling streets, an unexpected web of signs and inscriptions caught their eye, small stones carved with intricate letters, each one an obscure regulation in a language that felt both foreign and vaguely familiar. The city, it seemed, was built on a foundation of rules woven so tightly that even a simple errand might unwittingly violate some invisible decree. The traveler, perhaps naive, thought the day would pass quietly, unaware of the invisible trap of the law that loomed like a silent sentinel nearby. As the sun climbed higher, the traveler found themselves navigating a maze of decrees, an almost humorous tangle of property rights that barred outsiders from touching certain land, and mandatory registration with a curious census that felt more like a secret ritual than civic duty. Every step was shadowed by the possibility that someone might allege misconduct, an accusation that could turn swiftly into punishment. Small, mundane interactions became fraught with hidden meaning. A glance, a casual conversation, all underestimated, could be misconstrued as espionage. The subtle sense of paranoia crept in as distant guards' footsteps echoed with a relentless rhythm, reminding them that in this city, the law was both a structure and a shadow. The travelers' attempts to blend in were met with an unyielding wall of unspoken rules, leaving them oddly small within the vast, silent bureaucracy. Irony was never far in a city stitched together by such delicate, absurd threads, rules so obscure that even the locals joked about the confusion, their faces blurred behind a veil of everyday indifference. The traveler, observing now the weariness etched into the city's fabric, chuckled softly at the thought of proposing reforms. Perhaps fewer laws, or maybe just a map that made sense. Yet even the humor felt distant, as the weight of potential punishment pressed on their shoulders. A swift, brutal shadow ready to strike at the slightest misstep. The clang of a metal door, or the quiet grunt of a guard, reinforced how easily one could be branded a spy for asking the wrong question. Here, in this sprawling labyrinth of statutes, innocence was an unknowable concept, and every day was a delicate dance of caution and silent understanding. Gradually, the visitor began to settle into a calm rhythm, observing the gentle bustle of daily life, bakers kneading dough, children playing with simple stones, unaware, or perhaps unbothered by the web of laws, quietly encasing their routines. The oppressive weight of the legal maze softened, not because it disappeared, but because acceptance grew in quiet moments of pause. The sounds of worn-out sandals brushing against the ground, the faint scent of roasted grains, blended into the slow, predictable heartbeat of a city that had long ago learned to coexist with its invisible chains. The traveler, tired now, found solace in the mundane and the familiar, realizing that even within the most rigid structures, human resilience persists, not in defiance, but in gentle, enduring adaptation. The law, after all, was just part of the landscape, as constant and unremarkable as the setting sun, casting long shadows over ancient stones. As evening descended softly over Rome, the traveler reflected on the quiet absurdity of their journey, a vivid reminder that human beings are both prisoners and architects of their worlds. The law, with all its subtlety and ironies, shapes lives in ways often unnoticed until one steps back, takes a breath, and simply observes. The blurred faces of prophets, guardians, and common folk all share the same silent patience, faces hidden by light or shadow, each carrying stories of small rebellions and quiet compliance. Perhaps, in some distant way, the true lesson was the recognition of daily endurance amid the rules we never fully understand, wrapped in the ordinary, seasoned with irony, quietly surviving beneath the weight of the law. This city, this history, tired, wise, and slightly amused, remained a mirror to human imperfection, softly reminding us to look, listen, and perhaps sleep a little more easily. In the early days of Rome's dominance, a traveler might have wandered through busy streets lined with marble facades and shaded awnings, believing that abundance and order would always prevail. The markets hummed softly with barter and murmured requests, where vendors displayed bright fruits and sturdy loaves. Yet, beneath this calm veneer, the shadows of scarcity already lurked, as supplies were confiscated for the legions or rationed for the city's elite. The common folk felt a quiet discomfort, like a slowly ripening fruit that leaves a faint ache with each bite. The traveler, carrying only a small satchel, marveled at the vibrant chaos, unaware that the fire of hunger flickered just beyond the marketplace's cheerful clamor. In these moments, history whispered softly that even wealthier streets could hide the brittle edges of a fragile supply chain, waiting to crack. Soon, the tension grew palpable. Fleshless faces and hollow eyes appeared in narrow alleyways, where children pawed at empty bowls and vendors shouted to no one in particular. Markets turned frantic as barter became more desperate. A handful of olives for a piece of cloth, a scrap of bread traded for a ceramic cup. The city's narrow insulae, cramped between thick stone walls and shared courtyards, became smoky with the scent of illness and damp. Where sickness spread quietly, unspoken but understood, the traveler noticed the faint scar of swelling on a merchant's hand. The worried glance exchanged in shadowed doorways, and realized that survival hinged more on patronage than on personal effort. This was not just hunger. It was the slow, unignorable yielding of a city's backbone, worn down by its own unspoken reliance on unseen support. There was an undeniable irony in this chaos. While the marketplaces buzzed with frantic bartering, the very essence of abundance was slipping away, replaced by a predatory game of persistence. A thin, spectacled man offered a broken shard of glass in exchange for a handful of dried figs, and everyone chuckled dryly at the absurdity. Yet their faces betrayed a deeper weariness. The poor moved with quiet resignation, knowing that even the efforts to find kindness in strangers might falter, that the walls of their insulae could contain sickness and misery as easily as they held memories of better days. The prophets, those shadowed figures in faded robes, spoke softly in distant corners, or were glimpsed as blurred echoes behind flickering lamps, faces invisible. guiding no one, but whispering of patience. Amid this irony, life persisted, unhurried and quietly exhausted, holding onto a fragile veneer of normalcy. Eventually, the city settled into a sluggish rhythm. The bustling energy of barter gave way to a quieter acceptance. Streets were lined with idle figures, eyes fixed on the ground or on distant horizons, as the sun cast a warm but gentle glow over the worn stone. The traveler, observing from a shaded bench, noticed how the market stalls remained mostly empty. Yet the sounds of footsteps, distant laughter, and soft conversations lingered in the air, reminders of human adaptiveness. The disease lingered unseen in the crowded quarters, but life's routine continued, perhaps more out of habit than hope. Some figures still moved in slow, deliberate gestures, mindful of sickness and scarcity, but not defeated, merely present, quietly waiting for a shift that might or might not come. Here, in the calm, after the storm of hunger and chaos, there lingered a sense of knowing how fragile human effort could be. In the end, the moral of this slow story remains simple. Even when streets overflow with history's grandeur, the human condition often whispers more quietly of vulnerability, dependence, and the slow endurance that underpins all the hustle. The traveler's journey, like many before it, highlights how easily abundance can be shadowed by scarcity, and how the unseen threads of patronage and health hold communities together. Faces blurred and shrouded by light, the forgotten prophets and silent witnesses remind us that no empire's strength is immune to the quiet cracks beneath its surface. As the city's shadows lengthen with evening, the quiet lesson endures. Resilience is often a matter of patience and survival, a gentle acknowledgement of life's stubborn imperfection. In the early morning haze of ancient Rome, the city's hum was quiet, save for the distant call of vendors and the slow shuffling of sandals on cobblestones. Travelers, if they could be called that, moved through narrow streets lined with simple wooden signs and open-air markets, unaware of the coming weight of the day. Somehow, life dripped steadily onward, as if each moment was just another brick in the unremarkable wall of daily existence, waiting patiently without urgency. Amid this normalcy, a stranger might feel the faint pulse of a society that valued spectacle, even if they did not yet understand its true rhythm. The day ahead, at least for some, would shift from the mundane to the extraordinary, though perhaps most would miss the subtle shift entirely. Suddenly, a herald's shout pierced the air, loud and formal, summoning everyone toward the grand stone structure that loomed over the city, the Colosseum. Faces turned from their chores, some glancing at the sky, others at the crowd gathering without questions or protest. Inside the massive archways, the cool stone gave way to glimpses of the arena central sand, a tangle of ropes and weaponry, and the distant roar of anticipation. For many, it was just another day's spectacle, a carnival of violence presented as entertainment. Yet beneath the surface, each step forward carried a weight of unspoken expectation, a reminder that survival was often dependent upon fitting within this social stage that thrived on chaos. As the monumental gates swung open, the audience's cheer became a steady hum of approval, sharp, eager, and insatiable. Gladiators, clad in dull armor, stepped into the sunlight with quiet resolve, their faces blurred in the collective eye of history, shadowed yet resolutely human. Wild beasts, their cages rattling softly, awaited their turn, large claws, heavy breaths, the quiet rustle of straw. The savage dance had no real winners, only the fleeting applause of a crowd hungry for blood, an irony not lost on the observer, who might find themselves pondering how society had learned to find satisfaction in spectacle over mercy. It was a game of life and death, played out under the watchful eye of an emperor who seldom missed an opportunity for caprice. As the fights concluded and the arena gradually emptied, the spectators began to drift back into the city's streets, their faces calm, almost bored, as if the day's brutal climax was just another routine. Shadows lengthened, and the guards wiped sweat from their brows, exchanging dry comments about the show. The massive stone walls absorbed the quiet return of normalcy, while somewhere in the background, the faint outline of a prophet's face blurred in the flickering sunlight, its expression unseen, perhaps thoughtful. In this moment of calm, the absurdity of it all sank gently into the collective memory that valued spectacle and narrative more than mercy or moral clarity. It was simply another episode in the endless story of a society that watched itself with a certain, weary detachment. Later, as night fell softly over the city, the idea of the day's chaos seemed distant, almost dreamlike, like a faint echo from an old, slow-moving river. People retreated to their simple homes, where they prepared modest meals and lingered in quiet conversations, the distant hum of the city now a gentle lullaby. If one looked closely, they might notice the faces of those who had fought in the arena, smudged, tired, oddly resigned, carrying the weight of a society that thrived on spectacle, but was indifferent to the individual stories beneath. Human imperfection lingered quietly, an echo of hope and tragedy in the same breath, all quietly folding into the slightly absurd, human-centered tapestry of life in ancient Rome. And somewhere in the stillness, the memory of the bloodied arena faded into the calm night, yet remained part of the silent story of a world that watched, always watchful, always detached. In the stillness of the late afternoon, a wanderer paused at the edge of a bustling Roman marketplace, eyes drifting over the orderly rows of stalls and the quiet hum of merchants exchanging small goods. The weight of history pressed lightly against the present, the low murmur of Latin voices, the clink of coins, and the scent of bread and olive oil lingered like a distant memory. With a faint, uncertain smile, the traveler considered how fleeting such moments of peace might be if one were truly immersed in it all. Perhaps here, amidst the mundane rhythm of daily life, there was a fragile promise of survival, a whispered hope that one could slip past the relentless veneer of order. Yet, even as they hesitated, the sense crept in that this peace was only a delicate veneer, easily shattered by the unseen pulse of violence and scarcity waiting just beyond the horizon. As the shadows lengthened, tension tightened around the traveler's shoulders. Patrols moved silently through the crowded streets, their eyes sharp beneath the curved helmets. A hurried glance at a passing official revealed a hand extended, palm open, demanding a coin, a small, tempting bribe to gain passage through the city's limited corridors. The traveler effaced their anxiety, slipping a coin into the outstretched palm, feeling the roughness of the metal against trembling fingers. Every step was performed with cautious precision, aware of the thin line between cautious movement and provoking suspicion. The sense of escaping into the chaos of the city gave fleeting hope, but it was tempered by the realization that such maneuvers were only temporary. The empire's order was woven tightly, and even small acts could spiral into peril. Irony dripped from each hurried exchange and clandestine gesture. Each attempt at escape was a quiet act of rebellion, yet underscored by an unshakable fact. The empire's relentless machinery of control ground on indifferent to individual stories or secrets. The traveler's mind drifted momentarily to the prophets and wise men whose faces remained unseen, hidden behind veils of shadow or bright light, small, faceless icons in a sprawling, unyielding system. Their distant, blurred faces seemed to mock the idea of sanctuary in such a vast, fatigued world, reminding the traveler how fragile any hope for safety really was. Here, in the muted chaos, every human effort to carve out room for oneself was seeped in irony. Survival, after all, was an uncertain illusion when blood and scarcity dictated the rules. Eventually, the traveler found a quiet corner behind a crumbling pillar, breathing slowly in the cool evening air that smelled faintly of sweat and damp stone. With trembling hands, they leaned back against the cold roughness, watching the slow passage of merchants and common folk, each absorbed in their routines. unaware of the silent struggles around them. The stillness felt oddly comforting, a peaceful interlude in the chaos, a reminder that life persisted, even in the face of relentless order, scarcity, and violence. The scene was ordinary, a worn cloth draped over a simple wooden table, the distant clang of a smithy's hammer, a child's laughter fading into the shadows. In this quiet moment, the weight of history pressed gently, urging reflection on how fleeting and fragile human resilience really was in this vast, demanding empire. As the darkness deepened, the traveler's thoughts lingered on how a single day in such an empire would mirror the delicate balance of human effort and all-consuming power, scarcely beyond the reach of chaos or collapse. The empire's relentless order, combined with hunger and violence, ensured that any outsider's presence was only temporary, swept away by the tide of systemic violence. They mused quietly that survival was perhaps not a matter of strength, but of quiet surrender and cautious patience, like the slow drip of water seeping through stone. With a slow sigh, the traveler accepted that they had come too far, alone in a city and a world far too vast and indifferent for safe refuge. The distant stars above offered no answers, only the soft reassurance that history, like all things, moved slowly, and perhaps that was enough for tonight. As dawn spills gentle light over the uneven cobblestones of Rome, Marcus stirs in the narrow, straw-filled confines of the ludus. The air is cool and thick with the scent of dried sweat and rough linen, a quiet reminder of the many mornings that blur together in this shadowed space. He slowly unwraps himself from the blanket, blinking at the faint outline of fellow slaves already beginning their routines. Outside, the distant clatter of metal and muffled voices hints at the world waking beyond these walls, an ordinary start in a life destined for spectacle. There's an odd comfort in this stillness, a pause before the day's inevitable grind begins to fold in around him like an old, familiar cloak. Later, Marcus is introduced to Lucilla, a veteran gladiator whose weathered face holds stories of past glories and quiet defeats alike. She smiles with a slow, tired patience, gestures to the training yard where rough ropes and wooden weapons lie scattered. The morning routine, with its relentless drills and routine shuffles, unfolds like a predictable dance, pulling, stamping, and sweating beneath the weak sun. Despite the harshness, there's a strange familiarity in the cadence, a rhythm shared among the men and women who have tread this tired path before him. Yet beneath that monotony lies a faint, ironic humor. How they all pretend that everyday pain is just part of the game, as if that makes it any easier. As the sun climbs higher An announcement echoes faintly through the sawdust-filled air, carried in by a breathless messenger, whose face remains obscured by shadow. Today's games, he says, will require a new face, someone fresh, someone untested. There's no mention of fear or excitement, only a quiet understanding among those listening. Marcus feels a flicker of awareness, an odd, almost polite irony that dedication here is measured by the imminent risk of violence, by how well one can perform the grim ballet of survival. The words drift past him like a sigh, another reminder that in this place, life is both ordinary and extraordinary, in the slow, unremarkable way of stories that quietly endure. Later, as the afternoon wanes, Marcus finds a moment of calm amid the chaos, sitting quietly beside a small, cracked basin, splashing water on his face. The world outside the arena's immediate chaos seems distant here, mundane, even an endless cycle of training, waiting, and brief respite. Lucilla sits nearby, her face turning softened by the faint glow of dusk, filtering through a tiny window. There's an unspoken understanding that tomorrow might erase today's fragile peace. Their shared silences feel heavy with unspoken stories and the weight of unnoticed struggles, yet also laced with a gentle, enduring humor about how humans adapt and accept their small, repeated hardships. It is a quiet pause, a moment to breathe in the slow hum of the ordinary life they all cling to, in defiance of the chaos outside. As night finally settles over the ludus, Marcus reflects on the strange, unassuming day it has been, marked not by grand heroism or tragic flair, but by the subtle persistence of everyday life in a place built on spectacle and silence alike. The shadows lengthen, and the cool darkness seeps through the cracks, gently wrapping the room in a muted calm. He listens to the distant hum of other lives going on beyond these walls, murmurs of routine, the faint click of chains, the soft breathing of tired souls. Somewhere unseen, figures blurred in shadow and light remind him silently that everyone's story, no matter how mundane or extraordinary, shares this quiet patience. There's a strange beauty in that endurance, still and gentle, like a lullaby for the human heart, worn but unbroken. In the early morning light, Marcus arrived at the training grounds, where the air was thick with the scent of dust and worn leather. The Lanista, a tall man with wary eyes partially hidden beneath a worn hood, watched silently from the side as the new gladiators prepared themselves. Marcus's movements were cautious, tentative each step, feeling like a small act of obedience to rules he barely understood anymore. The rhythm of wooden swords striking shields echoed softly, almost like a lullaby for the tired, unambitious workday. Around him, Other men sat on broken benches, their faces calm but contemplative, knowing the day's chores would leave marks, both seen and unseen. As the hours wore on, the drills grew more intense. Sparring pairs clashed with wooden swords. Shields were herded into tight formations, and Marcus found himself gasping between each exhale, acutely aware of every small misstep. The training was relentless, a slow and deliberate reminder that his body was now a tool shaped by muscle memory rather than hope. He flinched when a sudden blow from a fellow trainee left a sharp ache on his arm, a sting that made him bite back a grimace, feeling the weight of his own vulnerability. Rumors of a deadly beast lurking beyond the camp's borders drifted through whispers, adding a faint spot of tension to the otherwise measured routine. Ironically, the morning's hardship was punctuated by a slip, and Marcus's shield arm caught an unexpectedly sharp jab. A splintering crack echoed softly as he collapsed onto the ground, stunned by the pain. The crowd of hard-faced men around him paused, some exchanging knowing glances, as if this was just another small chapter in their shared boredom. Lucilla, who had observed quietly from her shaded corner, approached with a calm grace, her hands reaching out as if to steady not just his form, but his weary mind. In a moment of unexpected tenderness, she revealed a few secret techniques, small, gentle adjustments that eased the sting and reawakened his confidence. The rumor of the beast faded into background noise, replaced by the truth that sometimes survival depended on unseen human kindness. Later, as the sun dipped lower, casting a warm, diffused glow over the camp, Marcus sat on a humble bench, muscles relaxed, but mind alert, pondering the quiet chaos of the day. The usual din had softened into a gentle hum, punctuated by the distant clink of metal and faint laughter. The tired faces around him seemed to settle into a shared sense of patience, knowing that the training was not just about fighting, but about enduring silently and steadily. He watched shadows fold into shapes he couldn't quite place, feeling both small and strangely connected to all these other fragile bodies, each trying to pass through another day of uncertain survival. Somewhere in the stillness, he figured that perhaps courage was just the rare ability to keep going in the slow, mundane rhythm of life. In the quiet moments after sunset, Marcus found a strange comfort in the mundane task of folding his worn tunic, an act of quiet acceptance rather than triumph. The day had left its marks, of course. Bruises and flickers of doubt flickered beneath his skin. Yet, as he sat there, the distant image of the unseen beast was far less pressing than the simple, honest reality of another long, slow day survived. The camp's subtle hum seemed to whisper that everyone was just waiting for rest, for resolve, for the dawn that would bring more of the same. In this muted world, beneath the fading light, he realized that life as a gladiator was perhaps less about conquering fear and more about enduring it with a modest, knowing spirit. In the quiet dawn of what could be considered a day's beginning, Marcus and his fellow fighters moved through the market-lined streets of Rome, their rustling tunics and clinking chainmail quietly merging with the everyday sounds, vendors calling, children's laughter, the distant hum of city life. The crowd's murmurs grew as they approached the grand arches of the Colosseum, a massive structure that cast long, gentle shadows in the late afternoon. Marcus felt the weight of his armor pressing against his shoulders, a familiar and steady reminder of the day ahead. Yet the eyes upon them carried a strange calm that bordered on routine. The city, vast yet intimate in its timelessness, seemed to watch without judgment, as if the spectacle was merely part of its endless story. Somewhere behind the blurred faces of prophets, or the distant glint of a sacrifice's altar, human lives went on happening, quietly and without grand drama. As they entered the arena's shadowed corridors, the crowd's roar transitioned into a rhythmic hum, a slow, awakening pulse that echoed through the stones of the Colosseum. Marcus's pulse matched the distant thudding of footsteps and the faint scrape of weapons being sheathed. The earth beneath their feet was cool and rough, grounding them in a moment that felt both fleeting and eternal. Yet, beneath that calm, a flicker of tension stirred an unspoken awareness of the uncertain dance that awaited. The distant blurring of prophets' faces, or the unseen, shadowed guards watching from above, offered no real clues. Human fate was a quiet mystery held in the soft light of fading day. In this suspended space of anticipation, even the most ordinary breath seemed slightly haunted by the weight of impending action. Then, almost as an ironic twist of fate, a sudden tremor coursed through the arena's foundation. The stone walls shivered subtly, causing a ripple of cautious glances among the fighters. Without warning, a narrow trapdoor, a small, unassuming panel set into the sandy floor, flipped open just momentarily, revealing darkness beneath. The crowd bloomed into a restless murmur, their voices rising in a hum of confused amusement or mild annoyance. Such interruptions had a way of reminding everyone of how fragile human plans could be, even those built with armor and discipline. Marcus's eyes flicked to the unseen depths below, pondering the theater of control and chaos. The arena, majestic and ancient, managed to smile quietly at its own small absurdities, little breaches in the grand design. The tremor subsided, and the crowd's voice softened back into a gentle, familiar din. Marcus took a slow breath, feeling the cool evening air seep through the gaps in the stonework, carrying with it the faint scent of olives and distant fires. The shock had been brief, an unnoticed reminder that even in human endeavors of strength and endurance, the unexpected remains a quiet, persistent force. He steadied himself, slightly amused at how such moments could momentarily unsettle even the most hardened fighters, only to settle into a calm acceptance that life continued, unperturbed. The twisted irony of being prepared for death, while the arena itself seemed to playfully toy with the sharp edges of certainty, offered a strange comfort of sorts, a reminder of their shared human imperfection. Fragile, yet resilient. As the day waned into quiet dusk, Marcus sat on the edge of the arena steps, the sand cool beneath his fingers, gazing at the distant city lights flickering like tiny stars in a planet too tired to care. The crowd's roar was a distant echo now, replaced by the peaceful hum of the setting sun, and a city that knew its routines days like this, stone and human flesh, intertwined in a slow, silent story of endurance. The warning of the trapdoor remained a minor, almost humorous detail in the larger weave of history, a subtle reminder that even great structures and brave fighters are subjected to the gentle, indifferent flow of time. With a small, quiet smile, Marcus allowed himself to rest, knowing that tomorrow, whatever it might bring, would arrive with the same unhurried certainty as today. Unremarkable, yet quietly significant in its own way. As dawn seeped into the cold stone of the Colosseum, Marcus prepared himself quietly, the sweat of yesterday's effort still clinging to his skin. The crowd's murmur was distant, a dull, rhythmic hum that blended with the clang of metal and the faint scent of dust in the air. He tightened his grip on the gladius, feeling the weight and cold promise of the blade, as though it were an extension of this oddly still moment before chaos. The subdued light cast gentle shadows across the sand, and for a brief, almost absurd instant, it all felt like an ordinary day, just one more day of patience and waiting. Somewhere behind the scenes, unseen prophets' faces blurred in the flickering torchlight, quietly observing human endurance beneath their cloaked mysteries. When the signal finally sounded, Marcus stepped cautiously into the arena, where the harsh glare of the midday sun met the rough texture of the stone walls. Opponents approached, one a seasoned Retiarius, the other the roaring, golden lion, each one eerily calm in their own way, as though such violence were just part of a normal routine. The clang of weapons echoed like a tired symphony, insignificant yet relentless, as Marcus lunged and dodged through a dance of shadows and light. The atmosphere thickened with tension, But the tiredness in the crowd's eyes was more apparent than their bloodlust, their attention flickering like a flickering lamp. Behind the scenes, figures in plain robes watched silently, their faces hidden, unmoved by the spectacle they had seen countless times before. In the midst of the fray, an ironic calm settled over Marcus, an almost dry humor at the absurdity of it all. The lion's fierce bellow vibrated through the air as the beast lunged, claws digging into the sand, eyes wild and unfocused. Marcus saw an opening and fainted, trying to bait the lion into a careless attack. But the beast, driven by instincts sharper than any human thought, spun wildly, knocking over a broken amphora and scattering shards across the arena floor. The crowd gasped, not out of fear, but mild surprise. Another twist in this slow, weary spectacle. Somewhere in the shadows, the unseen prophets' faces blurred into faint smiles, as if they had already predicted the strange course of this day's events. A quiet moment followed, an odd lull beneath the thunder of cheers, and the roar of the lion retreating into the shadows. Marcus, panting softly, felt the rough texture of the stone beneath his palms, and the warmth of his own blood that seeped unnoticed from a minor cut. He no longer looked at the roaring crowd or the bloodied weapons. Instead, he focused on the cool softness of the sand, a moment of peace amid chaos. The lion, now confused and agitated, prowled in circles, and Marcus adjusted his stance, quietly acknowledging the strange poetry of survival. The faces behind the scenes remained obscured, their expressions unreadable, perhaps amused by how human routines persist even in the face of death's slow encroachment. As the dust settled and the crowd's cheers waned into a soft hum, Marcus found a strange comfort in the stillness. Victory was simple and accidental, a fleeting twist of fate rather than mastery. The arena's harsh reality was now, quietly, just another story of human fragility, an ordinary moment painted in broad strokes of violence and patience. Somewhere, far away, the unseen figures watched without judgment, faces blurred in the golden half-light, acknowledging perhaps the quiet dignities in their human spectators' endurance. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the amphitheater, and the air grew cooler, as if even the day itself was ready for its slow descent into silence and memory, waiting patiently for yet another story to quietly slip away. As dawn's diffuse light crept into the sands of the arena, Marcus, battered yet silently standing, looked out at the quieting crowd. The air, thick with the scent of dust and old sweat, barely moved as the emperor's herald announced the day's end, the crowd's shouts fading into a gentle hum. For a moment, the worn warrior simply tilted his head, feeling the ache of muscles long used to standing still and waiting. The blade of sunlight traced slow patterns on his skin, a quiet reminder of another cycle beginning or ending in this endless routine. The immediate world, the cells, the crowd, the sand was still. And in that stillness, Marcus found an odd peace in his worn, familiar body. Then came the word from above, an echoing, official tone that granted clemency to the crowd's favorite survivors. Marcus's eyes drifted for a moment, caught between relief and fatigue, knowing that survival often felt like passing through a long, slow tide rather than winning a conquest. The crowd's cheers mingled with the distant clatter of the closing gates, a strange soundtrack to such a quiet moment. His bruised body protested as he moved, but beneath that protest was a flicker of something unfamiliar, hope, or maybe mere relief that the day's violence was done for now. There was no grand thanksgiving, only a simple acknowledgement of life's persistent stubbornness. A silent irony hovered in the air. The crowd celebrated those who had fought bravely, while Marcus's own injuries told a quieter story of pain and resilience. As he was led away, he caught sight of Lucilla, her face blurred by the shifting shadows of the audience, yet somehow familiar, both fragile and fierce in her quiet watchfulness. When offered a chance at freedom, he hesitated, knowing that leaving meant severing his ties to this strange, brutal stage. Irony lay in the fact that survival had little to do with heroism, and much more with endurance, the kind that wears quietly, unnoticed by the crowds who only want entertainment. Marcus's thoughts drifted to the life beyond the sand, subtle and distant as a memory flickering in the fading light. In the calm that settled after the day's chaos, Marcus sat amidst the remnants of the arena, splintered wood, empty water jars, and the faint echo of distant footsteps. The air was cool enough to feel like a kind of mercy, and his body, though bruised, carried a newfound stillness. Lucilla approached, her face barely visible in the dim. She offered a gentle, silent companionship, an unspoken promise of loyalty in a world that often felt too relentless for such bonds. He looked at her, sensing her quiet strength, and for a moment the noise of the day seemed to fade into a slow, breathless memory. It was the stillness after the storm, a moment to inhale what little peace could be found amid human imperfection and harsh routines. Later, as twilight deepened and the shadows grew long, Marcus sat at the edge of the arena, contemplating the porous boundary between freedom and responsibility. The promise of a life beyond the arena felt distant and fragile, something to be carefully shaped in quiet hope rather than loud declaration. In that subtle hour of reflection, he mused on the strange irony that surviving often meant staying on the margins of history, an unnoticed witness to the human dance of suffering and resilience. The soft hum of dusk filled his ears, and with a gentle, almost amused resolve, he softly vowed to carve some future out of the patience that age and experience had softly taught him. Beneath the fading sun, there was a quiet understanding. Life, like sand, shifts without notice, but it still quietly moves forward. Veteran centurion Lucius adjusted his helmet as he surveyed the snow-dusted peaks that scraped the sky beyond the thin edge of the empire. With slow, deliberate steps, he led a fresh cohort of soldiers across the heavy, cold alpine passes. The crunch of icy snow beneath their sandals, a quiet, persistent reminder of the journey's length. Their gear was humble cloaks that fluttered slightly in the mountain breeze, leather straps creaking softly, yet they moved with a practiced calm, as if shaped by endless marches rather than newness. The distant echoes of the empire's routine life felt hours behind, muffled by the mountains and the slow, patient breath of winter itself. There was an odd serenity in their solitude, a fragile sense that perhaps they were merely groping toward the edges of something larger, something perhaps unknowable. As they pressed onward, the landscape grew more unfamiliar, barren, rocky, the sky a vast, indifferent gray. Here, the local people appeared quietly, tending modest farms or watching cautiously from the shadows of their huts, faces blurred by distance and the soft shadow of early evening. Lucius made a slow effort to understand their simple gestures, an offer of bread, a wary nod, and recognized that even on the frontier, human routines persisted with quiet resilience. The threat grew unspoken but palpable. Rumors of tribes like the Marcomanni swirling beyond the distant forests, their intentions shadowed and slow to reveal themselves. The soldiers, aware of the growing tension, moved with careful patience, knowing that even a single misstep could upset the fragile quiet that stretched like an invisible tether between them and the unknown. There was an irony in their situation, Lucius thought, as he watched youths sharpen their blades or women mend woven cloth in near silence. Despite the weight of impending conflict, daily life continued with gentle, unremarkable persistence. Perhaps it was the slow rhythm of the frontier that softened urgency into a kind of mundane patience. Even the muted sounds of livestock and the low hum of distant conversations seemed to mock the seriousness of the rumors. The local figures, unseen by many, appeared blurred behind the faint play of shadow and light, their faces unknowable, their motives distant. As nights settled in, they gathered around small fires, talking softly of things that mattered less than survival, but lingered nonetheless in their quiet exchanges. Here, In this liminal space, slow humor and human imperfection defied the looming threat with peaceful, almost resigned endurance. Calm finally settled over the camp as Lucius, sitting quietly beneath a starlit sky, watched the gentle flicker of the fires and the soft breathing of sleeping soldiers. The mountain air grew still, and the sharp contrast of danger and peace seemed to fold into one another, an unremarkable, enduring truth of frontier life. Shadows shifted lazily on the tents, and the distant, slow-moving threat of the Marcomanni remained unseen, just beyond the edge of vision, like a story told in whispers by the wind. Lucius felt the weight of quiet human resilience, of lives shaped more by patience than by haste, and wondered quietly about the unseen faces of those locals, those faces blurred and hidden under the light or shadow, who carried their own burdens without asking for recognition. In their stillness, there was a strange beauty, a muted acknowledgement that life persisted quietly at the edges of empire, often unnoticed, but quietly essential, reflecting on their journey and the slow, unremarkable rhythm of life on the frontier. Lucius recognized that perhaps this was the true essence of the border, an ongoing patience with uncertainty, stitched together by small moments of human endurance. The mountains, the blurring faces, and the quiet risk of conflict all wove into the fabric of daily existence here, where stories were whispered rather than shouted, and every step was taken with measured care. As dawn threatened to break the long night, he felt an almost sleepy reassurance that despite the looming threat of the Marcomanni and the absurdity of human worries, life on the edge of the empire was quietly, completely human, imperfect, fragile, and somehow serene in its slow continuity. In the early mornings, behind the ancient walls, a small cluster of soldiers shuffled through the cold, their breath forming faint clouds in the crisp air. Marcus, a young legionary with wide, quietly observant eyes, watched the flickering torchlight dance on rough stone, feeling the weight of mundane routine settle in, the distant clang of metal, and the soft hum of whispered orders melded with the gentle scratching of scrolls and the rustling of worn cloaks, ordinary sounds that marked another day of enduring the frontier's harsh silence. Their faces, shadowed yet expressive in a tired way, showed no great enthusiasm, but a quiet acceptance of the endless sameness. Here, life was a slow, deliberate rhythm of survival, governed more by seasons and skirmishes than by anything grand or heroic. As winter deepened, the air grew colder still, seeping into the gaps of their thin tunics, and the rations dwindled to meager portions of dried bread and hard cheese. The soldiers, once full of youthful vigor, now moved sluggishly, their bodies weathered by the unyielding cold and unseen maladies creeping in. Marcus observed the slow unraveling of his comrades. One by one, they succumbed to fevers, or succumbed quietly in their sleep, their faces resting in silent resignation. The looming threat of raids pressed on their minds like the relentless winter wind, against which they had little effective defense. Ironically, the greatest dangers often came not from the enemies beyond the walls, but from the small, insidious enemies within, whispering of exhaustion, fear, and despair. Amidst these struggles, the soldiers found moments of quiet irony, like the ritual of sharing a stale crust, or the begrudging laughter at a comrade's awkward attempt to mend torn armor. Marcus, watching a fellow legionary trying to fix a broken sandal with a crooked needle, couldn't help but smile faintly at the simple absurdity of it all. Prophets or seers, often shadowed behind a faint glow of dawn or obscured by flickering torchlight, were consulted with hopes of reassurance. But their faces remained blurred, their words lost in the haze of uncertainty. Yet in these small acts, sneaking a glimpse of the distant woods, or exchanging half-hearted jokes, the soldiers managed a fragile thread of humor, woven into the fabric of a monotonous, exhausting existence. Life, it seemed, was a quiet, endless succession of small defeats and minor triumphs. With spring's tentative arrival, a gentle calm settled over the frontier, where the icy grip loosened and the landscape gradually woke from its frozen slumber. The soldiers settled into a slower steadiness, their routines softening, but never disappearing entirely. Marcus found himself daydreaming about distant cities, a life beyond the walls that now felt both familiar and faintly absurd. The constant sight of blurred, shadowed figures, prophets, officers, or enemies, remained a reminder of the unknown and the unknowable, their faces forever hidden behind veils of light or shadow. Yet amidst the small daily motions, feeding the fires, checking the walls, exchanging sparse words, there was a quiet peace in knowing that, despite everything, life persisted in its gentle, subdued fashion. The frontier, with all its perils, had become somehow both an ordeal and a kind of sanctuary. In the stillness of these distant outposts, Marcus reflected on the strange, slow story of human endurance, etched into stone and memory alike. The soldiers had come to accept that their lives were fragile, woven from routines both mundane and vital, amid a landscape that offered little comfort, but plenty of quiet irony. Faces blurred by time and shadow, they endured not with grand heroism, but with a muted dignity that seemed almost amused at its own perseverance. The walls, the cold, the whispers of distant foes, all had become part of a story about ordinary people managing to carry on in a world that refused to provide easy answers or dramatic endings. And so, beneath the weight of history and the slow rhythm of the seasons, they simply waited quietly, patiently, human in all their imperfect moments. Under the dull glow of early evening, the watchtowers stood like quiet sentinels along the frontier, their timbers weathered yet dependable. The soldiers, weary from the day's patrols, settled into routines, exchanging few words and attentive to the faint rustling of leaves and distant sounds of animal movements. Among them, Lucius moved through the camp with a calm, measured gait, his helmet slightly askew and his thoughts drifting to the coming rest. It was a day much like any other, quietly slipping toward the night's slow passage, where the mundane became the backdrop for their fragile peace. Without warning, the darkness was fractured by flickering flames and the sharp crackle of burning wood, disrupting the restful silence. The watchtowers, now aflame, cast orange shadows that danced erratically across the camp, waking everyone with alarm and confusion. Lucius' heart leaned lightly into a knot of tension as he hurried to rally his men and assess the chaos. There was no immediate sign of the enemy, only the relentless licking of fire and the smell of smoldering timber. In moments like these, the line between routine and peril blurred quietly, leaving a heavy sense that nothing was truly certain on the frontier. Amidst the chaos, an irony gently emerged beneath the frantic commands and hurried movements. It all seemed oddly ordinary, like a badly scripted play. A local guide, whose face had long been cast in shadow, appeared fleetingly at the edge of the camp, whispering hurried directions before disappearing into the night. It was difficult to discern whether he was a traitor or simply careless, but his actions set a new tone for the evening's quiet tragedy. The enemy's approach, guided by whispers and shadows, underscored the precariousness of trust and the subtlety of treachery, details as human and imperfect as the camp itself. As the flames slowly burned down to embers, the camp settled into an uneasy calm. Men cleaned soot from their hands and examined their gear in the dim light, each absorbed in small, familiar motions that momentarily masked the unease. Lucius, with a faintly tired expression, stared at the faint glow on the distant horizon, contemplating the night's events and the strange, silent cost of their vigil. The shadows cast by the remaining flickers seemed to stretch longer, blending into the dark that promised more challenges ahead, yet also a strange comfort in its quiet persistence. It was a pause, an unspoken acknowledgement that life, with all its minor perils, merely continued through the night. Later, as dawn approached quietly, the soldiers looked back on the night almost wistfully, recognizing the delicate balance they maintained in this fragile borderland. The watchtowers, now blackened skeletons, seemed less like fortresses and more like markers of human imperfection, temporary arrangements in a landscape of constant uncertainty. Lucius reflected on the absurdity of it all, how the quiet, the routine, and the betrayals wove together into the slow tapestry of frontier life. There was no heroism without vulnerability, no certainty in the shadows, just a shared acknowledgement that, even in their tiredness, human beings carried on, quietly, imperfectly, and with a gentle humor that lingered in the fading light. On a quiet dawn along the rugged frontier, the Roman legion prepared itself as they had countless mornings before, leaning on their spears, tightening their armor, and exchanging subdued nods. The frozen surface of the Danube shimmered faintly under a pale sky, silent except for the faint cracking of ice. The soldiers, weary yet accustomed, looked out over the sluggish water, knowing that today's routine might soon shift into chaos without warning. Among them, Lucius and Marcus moved slowly, their faces shadowed by the low sun, lost momentarily in thoughts of home and destiny. It was a day like many, seemingly mundane, yet threaded with the weight of unseen dangers hovering just beyond the horizon. As the morning progressed, the stillness fractured, faint signals and hurried whispers carried the arrival of the Marcomanni horde, a dark ripple against the icy river. The soldiers' faces hardened with a quiet acceptance of the inevitable. Conflict was upon them. Shields clanged into position, and the distant drums echoed like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. Lucius caught Marcus's eye, a brief flicker of a shared understanding, as the enemies drew closer with their shifting formations. The cold air crisped their breaths, and the difficulty of the task pressed quietly into their minds. Fight or flee, stand or succumb, all in the same breath, in a moment that felt almost designed by irony. The chaos erupted exactly where the bridge lay. The fragile structure that had supported countless crossings suddenly caught in the cold fury of battering foes. The soldiers, attempting to hold the line, watched as the enemy's spear tips and shields battered the wooden span. With a shared glance of resignation, Lucius and Marcus knew they might have to sacrifice the piece of ground they'd relied upon. As the bridge shattered under the weight of hostility, and wood splinters drifted like restless ghosts, they prepared themselves to make a daring change, leading a cavalry charge that seemed both reckless and necessary. It was perhaps the most human act of all, risking it all for the faint hope of turning the tide. With a calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos, Lucius and Marcus rode fast. The pounding of hooves and the whisper of wind, their only sounds amidst the battered landscape. Their cavalry burst through the flurry of snow and broken wood, their figures small yet resolute against the vast, indifferent sky. By some quiet miracle, the unexpected charge caught the Marcomanni off guard, forcing them into retreat, a slow, almost reluctant ebb that left a faint sigh across the frozen surface. As the dust settled and the soldiers regrouped, the river quieted once more, the warmth of exhausted relief mingling with the cold that lingered in the air. The front had shifted briefly, but the smell of ice and mud remained the same as before. Later, as the sun dipped lower and the day drew to a close, the soldiers lingered in the presence of the silent river, each reflecting in their own subdued way on the ordeal. The thrill of victory was muted by the knowledge that tomorrow might bring new threats or old frustrations. Lucius and Marcus, returning to the camp, found moments of quiet in simple routines, washing dirt from their hands, sharing a piece of bread, and watching the shadows stretch long on the landscape. The faces of their comrades, blurred by fatigue or the soft flickering torchlight, seemed to tell stories too tired to ask for more. In these small, mundane acts, they gathered themselves, waiting patiently for whatever came next, aware, perhaps, that their perseverance was nothing more than daily acceptance of perpetual uncertainty. After the final battle, the Roman soldiers, once tense with the silence of anticipation, finally found themselves standing amidst a landscape that now seemed oddly still. The dust settled on worn armor, the distant clang of weapons was replaced by a gentle breeze through the olive trees. Faces, once alert and strained, gradually softened into weary serenity as they looked towards a horizon that hinted at quiet stability. It was, in its own slow way, a moment of calm, if only temporarily, before the echoes of warfare faded into distant memory. The soldiers, some with battered shields, traced absent patterns on their palms, silently marking the end of constant vigilance for now. As the days stretched on, the tension shifted into quiet acceptance, but not without a touch of irony. The peace treaty clutched in their hands was a fragile thing, signed in the cool shade of an encampment with ink that blurred slightly in the humid air. Soldiers read the words over and over, perhaps hoping to find some certainty in the formal phrasing, yet knowing well that the frontier's unpredictability would linger. The ironically mundane routine resumed small chores, gathering firewood, mending tunics, as if these were the true victories, not the conquest itself. An occasional smile flickered between comrades, as if humor was the only way to cope with the lingering weight of their shared scars. In the slow hours of evening, when the sun dipped behind distant hills, the city and frontier seemed almost indistinguishable in their silence, both holding their breath at the twilight's gentle grip. Marcus, sitting on a stone, traced the edges of his battle-worn shield with tired fingers as light pooled over his face, blurred and shadowed as if behind a veiled curtain. His eyes, dull yet distant, carried the weight of memories that would not fade so easily. Nearby, a small group shared simple bread and olives, their voices low and unhurried, the ordinary act of eating grounding them in a transient peace that felt more like a pause than an end. The world looked softer now, bathed in the muted glow of dusk, as if even history itself had relaxed its grip. Somewhere between the words spoken softly and the unspoken thoughts, there was a quiet acknowledgement of their losses and their small triumphs. Lucius, shoulders slightly hunched under the weight of a pack, prepared to depart, the distant horizon marking the beginning of a different chapter, one that would include memories of the frontier. And the silent toll it took. His departure was unremarkable, and yet profoundly human. An ordinary man walking away from extraordinary circumstances, carrying the quiet echoes of fallen comrades and the unspoken understanding that empire's reach was always both grand and imperfect. He moved steadily, hands steady but face calm, as if he had already begun to forget the distant roar of the conflict's past. Still, in his mind's quiet chamber, the stories of those lost lingered like a faint, flickering flame. Finally, back among familiar sights, withered vines, distant hills, old stone walls, the soldiers returned to their routines with a strange sort of peaceful resignation. The triumph was quiet, almost empty of grandeur, but real enough in the small gestures, an idle watch over the camp, a light conversation, or the gentle clink of everyday objects. The scars endured, both seen and unseen, and served as gentle reminders that peace was often just a pause, not a conclusion. As night fell and the stars emerged, the landscape settled once more into a slow, ordinary calm, carrying with it the quiet wisdom that sometimes the greatest stories are the ones that end without fanfare, in quiet acknowledgement of human imperfection. In the narrow alleys of Aventinus, life begins at a slow, familiar pace. Young Lucius, a baker with fingers stained by flour, moves quietly among his small oven, the faint aroma of bread mingling with the smoky air. His sister Maya is nearby, hands busy with dishcloths, her face softly illuminated by the flickering light of an oil lamp. Outside, the constant hum of voices and footsteps drifts through cracked walls, an everyday symphony of cramped living. It's a life painted in small, familiar actions, where comfort rests in routine amid the dust and noise, even if the shadows of hardship linger nearby. As the day progresses, the crowded streets seem to swell with energy, yet beneath that liveliness, an undertow of tension persists. Gaius, an aging neighbor whose steps are slow and cautious, watches children dart past with worn clothes and tired faces. Every so often, a burst of smoke escapes from a nearby fire, reminding everyone of their fragile boundaries. One small spark could turn their fragile homes to ash. The risk of disaster keeps the air slightly tense, like a shared secret everyone knows, but never quite discusses aloud. In these moments, the irony nearly whispers. Life is about small victories, yet the threat of losing everything remains just a flame away. The irony of their daily life lingers quietly. How they find humor in the smallest signs of comfort, even as everything feels precarious. Maya sometimes jokes about what little they have, a stolen piece of fruit or a shared story under the faint light becomes their small rebellion against hardship. Lucius, with a wry smile, jokes that maybe someday they'd own a larger oven, though the humor is tinged with a shrug, acknowledging the distant horizon of better days. The unseen prophets, their faces blurred save for shadowed outlines, seem to watch silently, their presence felt but never seen directly. Life here is an awkward dance of resilience and mild humor, stitched into the fabric of everyday survival. In the calm of evening, the chaos of the streets mellows into a softer stillness. Gaius, leaning heavily on his walking staff, listens to the distant murmur of nocturnal life, a lullaby of distant chatter, the clatter of dishes, and the occasional soft footsteps. Inside, Lucius and Maya prepare to settle into their small, shared space, the walls lined with simple, worn furniture. The air cools slightly, touched with the scent of bread and aged wood. Despite their hardships, there's a quiet sense of peace, an acceptance rooted in familiarity and shared existence, as if the human spirit wraps itself tenderly around the fragile, imperfect home they have forged. Looking back through these moments, it becomes clear that life in a Roman slum, with all its noise and risk, holds a kind of quiet dignity. The faces blurred by shadow and light remind us that every human story is woven with ordinary acts, laughter, worry, patience, that quietly define us. Perhaps comforts like clean water or reliable safety seem distant in this rhythmic, unhurried world. Yet there is a gentle beauty in their persistence. As we drift into sleep, we see that even amidst decay and danger, the small human bits of life, hope, humor, routine, are what ultimately sustain us, softly and resiliently, through another day. In the waning light of a weary summer, Lucius family gathered by their modest home, a cluster of rough bricks and mortar that seemed to sag under the heat. The days had grown longer, and the sky stretched a relentless, cloudless blue. Their routine was simple and constant, waiting for the promise of water, a precious commodity that felt increasingly distant and fragile, like a faint memory of rain. The aqueducts, once sturdy and flowing, now dripped with cautious patience, their stones cracked and tired, whispering of days when water was more plentiful. It was a quiet beginning, marked by daily necessity and patience, as everyone understood this was life in a slum, smooth, slow, and unpretending. As the drought stretched on, the first signs of strain crept into their routine. Lucius' family prepared for their trek to the distant wells, a walk that seemed longer each day, through parched streets and cracked earth. The water they carried back was tepid and murky, sometimes tinged with an iron-like taste that lingered on the tongue. Vendors beside the roads sold water that shimmered strangely in the sunlight, sometimes clear, sometimes clouded, charged at prices that no one found surprising anymore. The desperation was quiet but undeniable, a tension woven into the ordinary rhythm of their lives. Each trip was a small ordeal, a reminder of how something so basic had become an uncommon luxury. One sweltering afternoon, Lucius watched as a water vendor displayed a new jug to passers-by, its surface dull and streaked with grime. The man's face was shadowed beneath a broad, sun-bleached hat, yet his smile betrayed a familiar insincerity, an unspoken knowledge that this scarcity turned simple exchanges into matters of survival. The family hesitated, knowing all too well the risks of contaminated water, yet their options had narrowed. It was ironic, really. The very people who once depended on the aqueducts now paid extra for water that might do more harm than good. A bitter reminder of how the human desire for convenience had transformed into a game of chance. Still, life pressed on quietly, inexorably, beneath the weight of unspoken compromises. Later, as dusk cast long shadows across the uneven streets, Lucius sat outside their home, feeling the coolness settle over sun-warmed stones. The tiredness was familiar now, blending with a sense of ordinary acceptance. The water was fetched again, the journey taken in a slow, measured way, almost meditative. The houses around him seemed to breathe slowly, shadows stretching lazily across cracked facades, holding stories of hardship and endurance. Here, in this calm, the absurdity of life's basic necessities, so desperately needed, yet so hard to secure, became a quiet, commonplace irony. The night was peaceful, and in its stillness, a quiet understanding settled in. Sometimes, simple life was only a matter of patiently enduring. In the end, the drought was just a chapter in a long story of resilience and human imperfection, an ongoing lesson about how something as natural as water could become an ordeal requiring patience and compromise. Lucia's family, like many others, found their quiet strength in these small acts, waiting, walking, paying, and remembering that this scarcity, humble as it was, revealed a fundamental truth about life's fragile comforts. The blurred faces of unseen prophets seemed to watch in silence, their faces hidden in the shifting shadows of past hopes and present realities. Perhaps, in their own slow way, they understood that the human pursuit of stability often hinged on patience, humility, and a touch of ironic humor at the ever-present scarcity of simple things. And so, life in the slum trudged forward, quietly, unremarkably, yet quietly resilient. In the waning light of a late afternoon, the insula's narrow alleys echoed with the faint murmur of daily routines. Wooden carts clattered over uneven stones, and linen drapes fluttered behind cracked wooden shutters. The residents, busy with chores and small conversations, seemed unaware that a silent specter was making its way through their cramped dwellings. The first signs of discomfort appeared slowly, a few restless nights, a shared cough that seemed ordinary enough in this bustling but weary neighborhood. Life, with its monotonous patience, continued as it naturally did, oblivious to the creeping shadow of an unseen threat. As days lengthened into weeks, the familiar rhythm of life began to fracture. Some residents fell ill with sudden diarrhea and fever. The narrow rooms offered no space for separation or retreat. There was a quiet, pervasive unease, that tense pause in daily movements, while neighbors exchanged worried glances, their faces blurred by hope and fatigue. Medical care, if it could be called that in these times and places, was scarce and indifferent to the suffering nearby. The sick lingered on, their bodies fragile, eyes dull with discomfort. As the communal sense of safety slowly unraveled in the narrow, suffocating space amidst the suffering, a certain irony settled like dust on the residents' minds. How life's simplest comforts, such as clean water or a decent place to vomit and recover, had become urgent luxuries. The feverish laughter of children once echoing in the streets, now hushed, replaced by quiet, anxious whispers, and the occasional gasp of pain. Even the local prophets, their faces obscured by shadow or light, seemed to offer little in the way of relief, just unspoken hopes and blurred, distant visions. The sense of a looming fate was both palpable and oddly mundane, as if this was simply another obscure chapter in their endless cycle of hardship. Gradually, the terrible fever itself ebbed, leaving behind a sense of calm that felt almost surreal. The air grew still, the crowded alleys settling into a tired silence that stretched like a long, slow yawn. The residents, exhausted but unbroken, resumed their daily routines with a quiet patience that seemed to carry both acceptance and resignation. Their faces, gentle and slightly amused by life's persistent absurdities, reflected a kind of muted relief. Even in this small, bleak chapter, the community carried on one small breath at a time, knowing full well that health and comfort remained fragile, precious things, not guaranteed, but hoped for. Now, in the slow quiet of reflection, one might consider how precariously thin the line between comfort and crisis truly is. The shadows of disease that once plagued these insulae reveal that human life's greatest interventions are often simple: access to clean water, space to heal, compassionate care. These fleeting moments of calm serve as reminders that what seems mundane at first glance, sleep, a wash of cool water, the touch of a gentle hand, are perhaps the most vital foundations for community and resilience. And so, history drifts onward, quietly observing the slow, imperfect, but persistent human effort to find comfort amid the shadows of hardship. In the quiet shadows of the ancient slum, life moved with a slow, predictable rhythm. Men and women wove through narrow alleys, their faces a blend of weariness and mild indifference, as children played nearby with chipped pottery and stray dogs. The daily routine consisted of fetching water from a shared well, tossing crumbs to the indifferent animals, and gathering around fires at dusk. It was a world shaped by necessity, where comfort was a distant luxury, and dignity was found in simple routines that persisted despite hardships. The horizon was often touched by distant temples or the distant hum of distant markets. But here, life was slow and unembellished, a steady monotony grounded in shared survival. One morning, a noticeable shift stirred in the narrow streets, an unusual activity, muffled voices, and the faint scent of something new. Rumors spread of a benefactor who had arranged for a temporary public bath and a small garden, an odd yet quietly hopeful gesture. As the slum's residents approached the new structures, they hesitated, some with smiles flickering under tired eyes, others with cautious curiosity. The bath was simple but warm, and faint steam curled into the air, while the garden offered a few sprouted herbs and flowers that looked unexpectedly delicate in the dust. It was a temporary oasis that interrupted the relentless sameness of their existence, briefly lifting the burdens of dirt and fatigue from their skin and spirits. Yet, beneath the calm surface, questions lingered. Was this kindness real, or just a passing fancy? The irony of the situation was clear. An outsider's generosity contrasted sharply with the everyday hardship that defined their lives. The bath's warm water, which flowed for only a few hours each day, brought a fleeting sense of cleanliness and relief, reminding them how much comfort was once taken for granted. Children splashed joyfully, their laughter echoing strangely amidst the serious faces, while elders observed quietly, perhaps remembering better times. The garden, modest as it was, offered a moment of beauty amid the grayness. Yet it too was fragile, a fleeting patch of green surrounded by cracked stone walls and smoldering ovens. As the water cooled and the garden withered, the slum's residents returned to their routines with a strange mixture of gratitude and resignation, aware that such moments were rare and ephemeral, like soft whispers of better days. Over time, the bath and garden became a calming presence, parts of their daily landscape, if only temporarily. The warmth of the water lingered in their memories during cold mornings, and the sight of green shoots poking through the cracked earth brought gentle hope. People resumed their quiet chores, with the faint awareness that some small kindness had reached into their world, softening its edges just a little. They carried on, faces subdued but not unhopeful, finding comfort in the faintest reminders that life's hardships could sometimes be momentarily eased. The hum of daily life, with its slow sounds and muted exchanges, persisted, a kind of peaceful acceptance. Each small act of care weaving into the fabric of their enduring existence. In this quiet transition, they drifted into a calmer understanding that comfort, however fleeting, still mattered. Looking back, the episode stood as a subtle reminder that even in places of hardship, human need for dignity and small joys persisted, unspoken but deeply felt. The blurred faces and quiet gestures reflected a collective acknowledgement that better days could be marked by modest acts, by warm water on a cold morning, or a handful of green in a dusty corner. Perhaps it was not much, but in those quiet moments, the slum found a gentle affirmation that life, in all its imperfect simplicity, was worth the effort of caring, however temporarily, to offer a tiny glimmer of relief. The memory of these small comforts, fading yet persistent, became a quiet part of their shared history, a slow reminder that beneath the surface of toil, humanity quietly nodded to itself, waiting patiently for another day. In the quiet shadows of a Roman slum, life moved at a languid pace, the morning light spilling weakly through narrow, muddy alleys. Children's laughter mingled with the sounds of water troughs, while worn hands passed bread with a tired patience. It was a world of simple routines, where the promise of a better tomorrow often seemed a distant whisper carried by the breeze. The thin walls of cramped dwellings held stories of daily endurance, each small act layered with quiet hope. Here, beneath the weight of history, Everyday life was a slow, unvaried dance, mundane, yet brimming with imperfect grace. As the days grew warmer, some things began to shift. An irregular flow of clean water arrived, and a new stone basin was installed near the communal hearth. For a while, the relief was tangible. The water was cool and clear, touching skin in ways that seemed almost miraculous. But the improvements proved fleeting. Clogged pipes soon reverted to their sluggish state, and the basin's edges cracked under the weight of neglect. The slum absorbed these minor changes with measured patience, aware that ephemeral enhancements often faded like breath in the air. The irony softly settled in. Comfort was temporary, a fleeting guest in a world used to waiting. One day, a shadowy figure in a simple tunic announced a new health measure, perhaps a visiting healer, or a passing official promising greater well-being for all. The faces around the communal bench blurred in the dull light, expressionless, yet quietly attentive. The healer's words, muffled by the faint noise of daily chores, hinted at a future where sickness might be less cruel. Still, the reality remained unchanged, leaking roofs, unwashed hands, and the slow, unavoidable march of time continued. The promise of better days lingered, but the irony was clear. Even aid, when distant, took on a softened, indirect humor, as if human effort was forever caught between hope and delay. Calm settled once more over the narrow streets as the fleeting improvements faded into memory, and life reverted to its unhurried rhythm. Old women swept the dirt with tired brushes, while men repaired broken tools with quiet resignation. Children played lazily by the shaded corners, their laughter faint and distant like a remembered song. The modest comforts, clean water, basic sanitation, health visits became gentle reminders of what could be, even if only temporarily, within reach. In this slow, unremarkable setting, time itself seemed to hold its breath, watching how humans adapt to impermanence with a patience that bordered on serenity. Looking back on those days, Lucius imagined a future where such simple amenities would become the steady foundation for all, not just fleeting moments for a few. His quiet dream was a long, soft hope, like the gentle fade of evening light that someday everyone might share in consistent comfort. The experience of witnessing temporary relief leaves a subtle imprint, a gentle understanding that progress is often slow and imperfect, yet still worth aspiring to. With a sense of calm acceptance, he realized that history's quiet lessons remind us how fragile and precious the comforts that modern life can bring, ever fleeting, yet deeply meaningful in their absence. On the dusty streets of Rome, a young man named Lucius watched the shadows of the grand Senate building stretch long in the late afternoon light. His hands, rough from kneading dough, rested on the wooden counter of his family's humble bakery, where the aroma of bread mingled softly with the distant murmur of arguments about grain supplies. The marble facade of the Senate gleamed like a distant, indifferent god, its marble eyes unaware of the small life below. As the patricians debated and jostled over power and resources, Lucius felt the tremors ripple through the cobblestones, subtly shifting the tide of his modest existence. The city hummed quietly around him, an enormous machine whose gears often turned just beyond the reach of ordinary folk. One morning, the distant crescendo of political disputes grew sharper, with senators raising voices over the latest grain allotments. Lucius observed a crowd gather near the forum, their faces marked by concern and fatigue, echoing his own weary hope for enough bread. He listened from a corner, pretending not to care about the grand disputes, but understanding instinctively that their fierce bargaining sliced into his own fragile livelihood. The irony of it all was somehow quiet. Those who argued about Rome's future seemed oblivious to the small, vital needs of its simplest citizens. Still, the market remained open, croaking with life, and small human dramas played out amidst the marble shadows. As weeks passed, the tension in the city became a routine background hum, like a faint heartbeat under a tired skin. Lucius noticed the slight slowdowns in bread sales, how the hopeful buyers hesitated and the baker's hands trembled just a little. The political disputes appeared distant now, cloaked in the same dawn-gray haze that softened the edges of daily life. A senator's face, often blurred by the glare of higher ambition, receded into the background of busy streets and quiet prayers. The irony persisted. While the senators and their grand plans moved in shadow, the true weight of their decisions pressed down more gently, but surely on those who simply wanted enough bread for tomorrow. Some days, Lucius found a strange tranquility in watching the endless routine flour dust drifting lazily in the sunlight, the slow rise of dough, the distant hum of voices negotiating beyond his sight. The city's small acts of endurance seemed to breathe a quiet resilience, almost like a shared secret beneath the heavy arches. The marble-fronted senators continued their distant debates, faces now obscured or shaded by the light, their words drifting over Rome like gentle, slow currents. Here, in the calm between political storms, life's small truths persisted: a handful of bread, a salutation, a moment of rest. It was enough to notice, enough to keep going. In the fading glow of evening, Lucius leaned against his work table, watching children play in the narrow alleyways, and the last traders pack their stalls. He reflected quietly on how history often forgot the soft, human rhythm of life, heard only in the gentle patter of feet or the faint clink of a coin. The grand halls of power, the blurred faces behind veiled curtains of politics, all seemed distant now, like a faded whisper. His world was measured in small, honest movements, a loaf shaped by patience, a smile shared with late customers, and as the shadows lengthened, he found comfort in knowing that, quietly, life in Rome endured, not with the drama of senators, but with the quiet persistence of ordinary hope. In the gentle hush of a summer morning, the Roman Senate gathered quietly. Officers of state exchanging small nods and measured glances. As Tribune Gaius Valerius rose, with a slow, deliberate motion, without much fanfare, he issued an edict demanding the immediate confiscation of wheat from markets. A simple decree that rippled quietly through the bustling grain stalls and humble vendors like Lucius. The usual hum of commerce faltered, replaced by a tentative tension. People looked at each other with uncertain familiarity, sensing that something unspoken flickered beneath the words. The day wore on, and the market's rhythm slowed, shadows cast by the late sun flickering over worried brows and hesitant hands. It was an ordinary moment with an undercurrent of change, quietly slipping into the fabric of daily life. As news of the decree spread, Lucius found himself caught in a swell of unease. A frantic vendor with trembling fingers pressed a bundle of bread and grain into his palms, whispering softly as if confiding in himself rather than Lucius. The vendor's eyes darted nervously towards the horizon, where darkening clouds of uncertainty gathered. Meanwhile, in a distant corner, a nervous aide of Senator Marcellus watched the scene with half-closed eyes, his face blurred by a faint, unseeing shadow. He mumbled something about hidden motives, hints of a game far bigger than simple grain. The air felt heavy with the weight of unseen forces, and Lucius, caught in this quiet chaos, sensed that the decree's purpose was woven with threads not yet visible, like shadows flickering at the edge of understanding. Amid the confusion, a touch of irony crept in. People who once valued the simple act of buying and selling now saw their livelihoods hinged on one uncertain edict. The vendor's frantic gestures and Lucius's puzzled expression seemed almost comical in their helplessness, as if the world had momentarily lost its grip on normality. The aide, whose face remained obscured by light and shadow, shifted nervously, silently revealing how fragile these political shifts were beneath their calm veneer. They all moved in a slow dance of patience and suspicion, waiting for the next ripple in a pond that refused to settle. The weight of small moments, wordless exchanges, hesitant offers, and quiet glances became quietly humorous in their shared human imperfections. As evening settled, the unrest ebbed into a calmer silence, with the market returning to its familiar, if cautious, rhythm. Lucius set aside the day's chaos, taking a slow breath as the sunlight waned, casting a warm glow over the simple objects of daily existence. The vendor, now a little more resigned, packed away what little they had, and the aide's figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows, unnoticed and untouched by the evening's quiet. It was as if everyone had agreed, perhaps unwittingly, to accept that some storms pass slowly, leaving behind only gentle ripples. The city's breath seemed steadier, yet beneath this calm, the faint memory of the day's disturbance lingered, like a half-remembered dream whispering softly in the back of the mind. Later, as Lucius strolled home through the quiet streets, he reflected on the strange, slow turn of events, the hidden motives behind the edict, the strange faces clouded by light, the fragile balance of power and chaos that defined their days. History, he understood, was often made in small, overlooked moments, words spoken softly or not at all, the quiet shifting of shadows behind a curtain. It was enough to make one wonder how many other unseen forces quietly guided their lives in the gentle hum of daily routine. There was no need for grand gestures or loud proclamations. The enduring truth was in the soft, persistent flow of ordinary life, carried quietly by the passage of time and human imperfection. In the slow, subdued light of a Roman morning, Lucius shuffled through the marble corridors of the Senate, clutching a small wooden box filled with sealed letters. His steps were quiet, almost as if he moved through a dream of political quietude, unaware of the subtle shadows that stretched behind the lofty columns. At this stage, he simply understood himself as a humble carrier, tasked with small errands amidst whispered debates and distant clattering of scrolls, never imagining how fragile his routine would soon be. The air was tinged with the scent of olives and dust, a reminder of the mundane yet weighty world he belonged to. Every breath felt like a small, unnoticed act in a larger, indifferent machine, turned by ambitions he could not see entirely. As days passed, Lucius began to notice strange glances exchanged behind veiled hands and hushed voices pinging through the stone halls. One morning, he was handed a thicker scroll, sealed tight with hot wax, its weight pressing down on his palm like an unanswered question. He sensed he was now caught between rival factions, those vying for influence, whispering of bribes and betrayals beneath the veneer of civility. An unintentional messenger, he carried secrets that could topple senators or ignite unrest. The quiet dread settled into his shoulders. Every step forward seemed to tighten a silent noose around his modest existence. Suspicion flickered at the edges of his awareness, like the faint light of dawn gradually illuminating shadows he never knew were there. With a gentle, sleepy irony, Lucius began to realize that the very act of delivering these sealed words placed him increasingly at the mercy of the Senate's ironic symphony, words written with the certainty of betrayal, delivered with the innocence of a child. The letters themselves had the finesse of woven threads, braided with lies and subtle threats, each one whispering of unseen dangers behind the masks of power. He noticed the faces of the senators, familiar yet blurred by the sunlight filtering through porticos, wearing expressions that never quite revealed their true thoughts. The small exchanges of his hands, passing parchment from one door to another, carried the weight of silent plotting. It was remarkable how ordinary his task was, yet how fraught with the quiet hum of impending chaos. Eventually, a calming realization settled over Lucius, like the slow descent of evening shadows. Perhaps the true power lay in the mundane, in these small acts of delivery and quiet observation. He found a certain stillness in their slow, repetitive rhythm, noticing how the Senate's intrigue, for all its danger, persisted as a series of small daily moments, meetings, scribbled notes, measured glances. The blurred faces of prophets and unseen figures seemed less distant now, hidden behind the soft glow of flickering lamps. The endless cycle of passing messages became a gentle, unremarkable part of life, echoing the unchanging nature of human folly and ambition. In those moments, Lucius glimpsed the faint hum of order within disorder, a quiet reminder of human imperfection's calm persistence. Looking back, Lucius's journey through the Senate's silent web of betrayal and alliance unfolded as a subtle meditation on the everyday absurdities that underpin power. His modest role, like a pebble dropped into a still pond, rippled quietly outward, touching the edges of events he would never fully grasp. The faces hidden behind flickering light remained blurred, yet their silent stories lingered long after his footsteps faded away. It was a slow, endless dance, delivering messages, sensing danger, and understanding that in the vast, weary machinery of politics, even the smallest act could carry profound consequence. In the end, life in Rome's grand hallways was, perhaps, a quiet testament to human imperfection, an ongoing, unremarkable story of people trying to hold together what was inevitably coming apart. On a modest morning in the marble halls of Rome, the senators gathered quietly, their voices subdued by the weight of tradition and the faint chill of the stone underfoot. Among them, A senator known for his lively speeches and broad smile moved slowly to his seat, unaware that this day would linger into a quiet legend. The air was thick with the scent of olive oil and dust, a reminder of continuous gatherings that often seemed more routine than momentous. As they began their deliberations, a subtle rustling of clothing and the soft tap of sandals punctuated the expected, mundane rhythm of political life. In the midst of these daily rituals, no one suspected that, beneath the veneer of civility, a shadow had already begun to fall. Suddenly, amid the heated exchange of voices on a contentious bill, a sharp thud echoed through the curia, startling and unnatural, followed by a gasp that shifted the room's calm into tense alertness. A hidden dagger had found its mark, and the senator's body crumpled silently, an exclamation in the silent language of violence. Guards leapt to their feet, and the crowd instinctively recoiled, eyes wide and hearts quietly pounding. A wave of chaos unfurled quickly, with shouts and hurried footsteps filling the cold marble corridors. In the midst of the turmoil, whispers spread like fire who was responsible, and who had been seen lurking in the shadows. For a moment, the historic hall was consumed by an almost human despair, an acknowledgement of human frailty amid the stone and marble. As the blood-stained scene unfolded, a twist of irony awaited. A common visitor, Lucius, had been present to deliver an innocuous message. A simple note from a senator to his colleague. Yet, in a cruel dance of misdirection, the guards mistook him for a conspirator, perhaps because of his hurried departure or an unnoticed glance. His face, normally unremarkable, now seemed caught between confusion and resignation, his eyes meeting those of guards wielding weapons, their expressions blurred beneath the flickering torchlight. The room's tense silence erupted into a flurry of accusations and clashing blades, none quite sure who was innocent or guilty. Lucius, feeling the weight of sudden suspicion, had no choice but to flee, stepping into the labyrinthine corridors that echoed with the sounds of chaos he hadn't sought. In the quiet aftermath, the dust settled slowly like a weary tide returning to shore. The senators gathered themselves, some retreating into distant corners, others silently contemplating the fragile veneer of their order. Lucius disappeared into the shadows, his breathing shallow, his mind caught between relief and lingering guilt. The marble halls, with their cold emptiness, seemed to stretch on endlessly, holding the memory of shared purpose now tainted by violence and misunderstanding. The air felt heavier, as if even the stones were tired of bearing witness to such human folly. It was a moment of calm amid turbulence, a reminder that beneath the grandeur, the human drama continued in its slow imperceptible ways, quietly reminding all that history's most profound moments often arrive cloaked in banality. As time passed, the story of that day faded into quiet legend, filtered through the lens of nostalgia and melancholy, an enduring testament to the absurdity of human conflict behind political veneer. Those marble walls, once echoing with the voices of kings and commoners alike, now bore the silent imprint of fleeting fury and misplaced trust. Lucius, having escaped the immediate danger, often wondered if anyone remembered his face or the simple truth of his presence. Human folly persisted in bigger and smaller ways, layered beneath the echoes of age and power. Perhaps, in the end, the real story was not about violence or suspicion, but about the fragile veneer of civility that humans, inevitably, wore like an old, threadbare cloak, sometimes torn or stained, yet always worn with quiet resolve. Lucius, a simple baker's son, watched the bustling markets of Rome from his small shop window as the sun dipped lower, casting a warm, golden hue over the stone streets. Life moved with quiet rhythm, people exchanging bread, merchants haggling softly, children's laughter fading into the evening air. Yet, beneath this peaceful surface, Lucius could sense an invisible tension swirling around the grander buildings, where senators gathered behind heavy wooden doors. He knew the city's fate was woven into their whispered debates, often brutal and tangled like the loaves he kneaded each morning. In the quiet moments, he sometimes wondered if the chaos was just a shadow cast by those who played deadly games with Rome's future, games he would never truly understand, only feel in passing tremors. Still, he kept calm, trusting that simple life's steady heartbeat was enough to keep him grounded amidst the distant storm. One evening, Lucius slipped away from his shop and navigated toward the dark alley leading to the Subura, where stories of power and peril seemed to hang thick in the air like the smell of burnt grain. From a shadowed corner, he watched silent figures, senators, guards, unknown faces line up in hushed urgency, their expressions blurred under flickering torchlight. He overheard snippets of threats and promises, like a slow, rustling tide of danger that threatened to drown any who swam too close. The Senate's deadly dance echoed in his ears, a game where alliances turned on a whisper, and a sudden breath could mean ruin. Despite the danger, Lucius felt a strange irony. These men, so eager to control Rome's fate, looked so ordinary in their shadows, almost like any other traders or craftsmen he knew. It was a quiet reminder that even power wore a human face, tired and uncertain. As the night deepened, Lucius found himself bemused by the absurdity of it all. The senators, who strutted and gestured with grandiose seriousness, were ultimately animate shadows flickering across the city's vast, indifferent dome. He smirked softly at how their talks of glory and betrayal often sounded like gossip among rivals over a shared loaf of bread. The sacred names they whispered, the threats they uttered as if sacred, they all blurred together, lost in the dull glow of the lamps. Meanwhile, the ordinary workers and bakers like himself continued their routines, unaware or perhaps indifferent to the deadly politics that churned behind those marble walls, which could topple entire cities or lift them into chaos. For reasons no one entirely understood, the irony was that in a city so grand and deadly, life droned on with quiet persistence. The bread still baked, the streets still filled with the routines of daily survival. Returning to his modest home, Lucius felt the peaceful hum of his family's bakery settle around him like a well-worn blanket. The smells of freshly baked bread filled the air, soft and steady, a gentle reminder that despite the chaos outside, life continued with its unhurried grace. He sat quietly, watching the flicker of a small lamp, contemplating the fragile balance between power and peace. How a single whisper in the Senate could shift the temperature of his world, or vanish without care, as if never spoken. Still, he understood better than most that surviving such a perilous storm demanded a kind of stoic patience and a willingness to keep one's stories and fears to oneself. The quiet resolve grew within him to keep his head low, to listen more than he spoke, to live just enough to witness Rome's restless, endless dance of politics and peace, side by side. And in his quiet corner, he found a kind of humble strength in the simple act of staying steady amidst the shifting shadows. Looking back, Lucius saw the story of a city built on fragile acts and cautious whispers, where even though the Senate's deadly politics cast long shadows, life persisted in the small, unnoticed moments. His own story was woven quietly into that tapestry, a reminder that survival often belonged not to those who fought fiercely, but to those who listened and kept their stories softly spoken. As he prepared for another day of baking, he felt a distant, gentle amusement at how the grand weavings of power never truly touched the humble rhythm of his routine. Yet they were all part of the same steady, timeless human pulse. Rome's fate, he mused, was forever slipping between shadows and light, a slow, inexorable dance that he would continue to observe from his small, quiet corner with patience and a faint, enduring hope.